Okay, today's video is about our new unit, about poetry, and I have why we write poetry here, but we're not going to get into that at all. We're going to start with why poetry, for one thing, and then how do you read poetry? Because poetry is completely different from anything we've already done. I've given you some definitions of poetry or some quotes about poetry. You may want to rerun these, come back to them more than once, but at the end I'm going to ask you to choose the quote that appeals to you the most and think about it on paper. The first one talks about what poetry is a record of some civilization's greatest writers and wisest people, taking on the questions and emotions that define us. And you notice they use the universal us. Robert Frost says, a poem begins as a lump in your throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness. D. Capella is a modern American poet, says poetry helps us negotiate the world around us. It helps us understand our own feelings about the world. These next three come from the same speech that John F. Kennedy gave at Amherst College shortly before his assassination. In part of the speech, he says, when power leads a man toward arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the areas of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence. And the third excerpt from that speech says, when power corrupts, poetry cleanses. For art establishes basic human truths, which must serve as the touchstone of our judgment. There's that universal our again. And the last three, a poet's work is to name the unnameable, to point out frauds, take sides, start arguments, shape the world, stop it from going to sleep. That's Salman Rushdie. He's a British poet. Carl Sandburg says poetry is the opening and closing of a door, leaving those who look through to guess about what is seen during the moment. And finally, Novalis is an ancient Greek poet. He says poetry heals the wounds inflicted by reason. Pretty heavy. Go back, rewind these. Think about the one that speaks to you and choose that from among all those that I've provided. What I'd like you to do is to copy the quote into your writer's notebook, and then I want you to stop and think about what you think it's saying about poetry. What does it mean to you? What does it tell you about what poetry means and why we read it? I'd like about a page. Please pause the video now and spend some time thinking about this. Okay, we're back. We're going to talk strictly about reading poetry because that's what we're going to be doing in class for the next few days before we actually begin the work of the unit. It's very hard to think about poetry unless you've read it and you have it in your bones. So here's kind of our purposes. We're going to be reading a lot of poetry, and here's why. Because the best way to write poetry is to read poetry, lots of poetry. What I want you to do is I want you to find a poet that speaks to you. I want you to find a poet that can sit down next to you in through his poems or her poems and be your mentor and be your teacher that can show you what poetry can do. The second thing is I want you to learn to read poetry with a pencil in your hand. You need to mark the things that strike you. You need to mark it up. If you bring me a clean piece of poetry, I know you haven't read it. I want you to mark words you like, words you don't know, words you don't understand, places you think are important, places that mystify you, places that just knock your socks off, places that you like where it sounds. Mark it up. And the big thing I want you to remember, and this is really a big thing when we get into poetry, and it's quite a shift from what we've been doing, is to remember there's no one correct answer. There's no one acceptable interpretation of a poem. Now, that doesn't mean that anything goes. There are limits that the poem gives you, just like any other piece of writing. But within those limits, Poetry is meant to speak to your individual experiences of the world, and those individual experiences have to be the first source of any interpretation. And because each of us are different, that means each of our interpretations are going to be somewhat different. Okay, the reason poets write poetry and the reason we read poetry is we read to see what emotions other people have experienced. We read to recreate others' experiences. We read to examine the inner experience of an emotion. We read to explore the problems other people are experiencing. We read poetry to play with words and to play with their sound. We don't read poetry, and this is critical. We don't read poetry for information. We don't read poetry to draw conclusions or for facts. That's not the purpose of poetry. Poetry is not nonfiction, nor is poetry fiction. Poetry is about the emotion, the feeling, the experience. We read poetry to connect us with others at that most essential level, that universal hour. We also read poetry to distance us from a familiar world. We read poetry to see the things that are familiar to us with new, fresh eyes. And finally, poetry is different from prose in the way it makes meaning. Poetry is like an onion, if you will. That's a metaphor there, guys. Or it's like a package within a present within a present within a present. There's layers of meaning in a poem for the reader to unpeel. So there's no one right reason for what a poem means, just ways to unpeel it. All right, any study of poetry, like I said before, is going to begin with reading it, immersing ourselves in it to get the feel of what poetry can do, what it sounds like, and how it makes meaning. And that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to pull out all my poetry books. You're going to have a poem assigned to you to look at, and then you're just going to read and collect. You're going to find what you love. You're going to find what moves you. There's a few simple steps that I want you to follow. And there's a lot of different ways to read poetry. This is just the way that I think is easiest for us. And I expect you to use these, please. Make sure you get them in your notes. You always begin with the title. And for me, I tend to ignore the title. You can't do that. The poet titles it for a reason. What does the title suggest to you? What predictions can you make? What do you think the poem might be about? Then read the poem straight through. Don't worry about stopping to figure things out. Just read it straight through and think about what it means in your own words. Paraphrase it in everyday language. This paraphrase should be a lot shorter than the poem itself. Don't worry about poet's craft or simile or metaphor. Just write what you think the poet's saying, literally, in your own language. Then go back and look at your paraphrase, and then look at the poem. Look for what you know. If it's a difficult poem or if there's a lot of symbolism, look at what you understand and what you don't. As you look at your paraphrase, which parts were hard for you to put in everyday language, or which parts don't make any sense when you translate them into everyday language? That's probably the poetic, and we need to go back and talk about it. Something else to do is to look at words that might have more than one meaning. Poetry is all about words, what they mean, how they sound, and different than the way we use words in fiction and nonfiction. So a lot of time, if everyday language doesn't work, it's because we have the wrong connotation of the word. And I'm going to talk about more about that in class. So look for words that might have more than one meaning. Maybe you're picking up the wrong connotation. Look for patterns. Poets choose words for completely different reasons than the nonfiction writer or the fiction writer do. So look for words that get repeated. Are there sounds that are repeated? Are there letters that are repeated? Do you notice a certain kind of imagery that comes up more than once? Is there figurative language the poet uses? Is there a sound or a color that seems to repeat over and over again? What do you notice about how the poet breaks his lines? Are there some long and some short? I wonder why. Are there lines that repeat within? How are the verses or the stanzas set up? What might the poet be trying to do with all of this? Remember, the best you can do is guess or speculation, that there is no one correct particular interpretation of all this. You're just trying to pay attention and figure it out. And then finally, go back and look at your paraphrase. Did you see things, or do you understand things differently than you did when you read it through the first time? This is where we're going to begin our study of poetry as a genre and our exploration of a new guiding question for this unit. Here's a warning for you. Please be sure that you have the suggestions for reading a poem in your notes, as we're going to be going back to this a lot in the next few weeks in class, and it's going to make it just that much harder for you if you don't have this. Okay, what I want you to do is to use the strategies I just described to think about this famous poem by Robert Frost. He's an American poet. I will have provided hard copies of this poem in class for you on Thursday and Friday, but if I forgot, or you lost it, or you left it in your locker, or you left it on the table, or whatever one of a million reasons you don't have it with you as you're watching this, you can also go to poemhunter.com and find it. Print it and glue it in your notebook, please. I want you to mark it up. I want you to go through the steps I just talked about. What did you notice about the poem? What do you think the poet is telling us? What is his point about life in general? Can you connect to the poem? What do you think the poem means? What's the point? So what? Remember, as always, you need to be an active viewer. Poetry is going to ask you to read and think in ways that are different from fiction and nonfiction, and it's going to take a different kind of effort on your part to make you comfortable with this. But you have so much to gain. Remember to pause, rewind, and review as you work through the information I've presented here. This information is the backbone for the rest of the work we'll be doing in the next few weeks, and it's important that you have it. Be sure you take good notes, as I went over in the changes to WSQ video. I will be checking, and I don't intend to initial your chart if it's not done well. I expect a question from you. A question can be one you have about the notes, one that requires application of the information in the notes, or one that challenges your peers' understanding of the material. I will not initial a question that's obviously literal information you simply lifted from the video and put a question mark at the end of. And finally, post your summary to NiceNet. Use the questions on your WSQ chart to guide the content of the summary, and remember, the summary is a paragraph, not a list of answers to the questions. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in class.